The iron trowel left my hand before my brain could stop it. Crack. Fresh blood dripped onto my pristine greenhouse floor. I just wanted to stop the beast destroying my rare orchids. But as glowing, amber eyes locked onto mine, my stomach plummeted. I didn't just hit a stray dog, I just drew the blood of the Alpha King. And he is not leaving until he gets revenge. Chapter 1. The burner phone rattled against the aluminum potting bench. It skittered closer to the edge, vibrating with a blocked number for the third time since sundown. Elara stared at the glowing screen. She refused to reach for it. Instead, her fingers gripped the pruning shears. The metallic click grounded the room. She snipped a bruised leaf off a rare midnight orchid, watching the toxic sap bead on the cut stem. One drop could drop a grown man to the floor. She liked surrounding herself with beautiful things that bit back. The screen finally went black. The hum of the climate control fans took over the glass dome again, pushing the scent of soil and blooming jasmine through the heat. Here she built a legitimate life. She scrubbed the undercity grime from her cuticles long ago, trading shadowy docks and smuggling routes for soil temperatures and fragile ferns. But Silas still possessed this number. A sliding scrape groaned across the glass ceiling. The shears slipped from her calloused fingers, clattering onto the concrete. A dull thud echoed from the roof. Not a branch, a body. Her pulse hammered against her eardrums, drowning out the fans. She backed into the shadows of hanging vines, letting the old survival instincts take the wheel. Her hand dropped under the counter, fingers locking around an iron trowel. Not a gun, but it would crack a skull. Above her, a streak of dark liquid smeared across the wet pane. The streetlights illuminated the crimson trail. Then the reinforced back doors exploded inward. Shards of glass sprayed across the pristine tiles. A towering shadow spilled into the humid sanctuary, dragging the stench of copper and freezing rain inside.
Half a mile from the sanctuary of the city conservatory, the foggy air of the shipping docks tasted like brine and treason. Kalen ducked a flashing blade, letting the metal slice his coat rather than his throat. Silver burned like battery acid where the steel bit his shoulder. 5 rogues waited in the shadows. They brought silver-laced weapons to an assassination attempt right on his territory line. Kalen lunged forward. Shifting would only pump the poison through his heart faster, so he stayed on 2 legs. He snatched the nearest rogue by the throat and squeezed until a wet crunch echoed over the crashing waves. 1 down, 4 to go. A serrated edge caught his ribs. Kalen stumbled, boots sliding on the slick concrete as warm blood soaked his shirt. Life drained from his veins. Worse, his pack slept in their penthouse across the city. Through the bond, they would feel his agony and blindside themselves trying to save him. He needed to sever the psychic tie. He had to run. He hurled a rusted shipping crate at the remaining attackers. While the metal crashed against the pavement and the rogues scrambled out of the way, Kalen turned toward the industrial district. He sprinted through an alley, tearing through a chain-link fence as his peripheral vision turned black. The glow of a civilian greenhouse cut through the fog. A pathetic place to hide. He scaled the wet brick wall and dropped onto the sloped glass roof. His boots slipped. He slid down the pane, leaving a streak of his own blood before hitting the pavement below. The rogues tracked his scent. Taking a running start, Kalen threw his broad shoulder against the reinforced doors. Metal buckled. Glass exploded. He collapsed onto white tile, gasping for air in a stifling cage of exotic flowers.
Dust motes danced in the sudden quiet of the shattered greenhouse. Elara pressed her spine against the damp brick wall, knuckles white around the iron trowel. The man bleeding out on her ruined floor towered even on his knees. He wore a shredded coat, his broad chest heaving with ragged breaths as a dark pool expanded across the white tile. He smelled wrong. Underneath the tang of blood, the scent of damp pine and wild predator choked the humid air. "Get out," she rasped. The intruder dragged his head up, his eyes locked onto hers, glowing an unnatural amber. The golden stare of a wolf shoved inside a human's skull. An alpha. The syndicate kings from the docks walked the earth, and one bled out right over her tiles. She swallowed the terror clawing up her throat. Silas taught her how to survive monsters. Never expose your neck. I said, get out, she commanded, stepping out of the shadows. I will call the cops. You bleed on my floor. A low rumble vibrated through the earth beneath her boots. He swayed as he tried to stand, reaching out a bloody hand with a desperate focus. Instinct hijacked her brain. Elara chucked the iron trowel with every ounce of strength she possessed. The metal sailed through the jasmine-scented air and cracked squarely against his cheekbone. A fresh line of crimson split his hard jaw. The clatter of the falling tool echoed off the surviving glass panes, followed by a suffocating stillness. Only the hum of the fans remained. You do not strike an alpha and walk away. Kalen refused to yell. He simply wiped the wet streak from his cheek with a thumb. He stared at the red stain, then fixed his glowing eyes back on her. In the span of a single breath, the dying man moved. He lunged across the tiles, slamming her backward into the brick wall. The sheer force of his broad frame pinned her instantly. A calloused hand clamped around her wrist, trapping her arm. He burned like a furnace. Instead of biting her, he leaned in and buried his face in the crook of her neck, dragging in a deep breath. "Quiet," he rasped, the sound like gravel grinding together. "You smell like dirt. You smell like the undercity." Her blood turned to ice. He knew exactly what she hid.
Between one ragged inhale and the next, his muscles gave out. Kalen collapsed against the cold floor tiles, his vision turning entirely black as the silver poison crawled toward his heart. The girl dropped to her knees beside him without a sound. She bypassed panic, her calloused fingers moving with brutal efficiency to rip his ruined shirt open. He needed a combat medic, but he had her. Reaching blindly into a ceramic pot on the floor, she yanked out a handful of dark green moss and crushed it between her palms. A bitter, sharp scent cut through the humid air. "Hold still," she ordered, her tone absolute ice. She jammed the crushed root directly into the gaping chest wound. A guttural roar tore from Kalen's throat. Fire shredded his nerve endings. Then, the burning receded into a dull, agonizing ache, and freezing the lethal creep of the silver. The hum of the climate control fans rushed back into his ears. Dust motes drifted under the harsh fluorescent lights, dancing in the wake of his scream. Kalen swallowed the thick taste of copper pooling in his mouth. He waited for the ringing in his skull to stop before he forced words past his teeth. "What is that?" "Blue vein root," she muttered, staring pointedly at his boots. "It neutralizes metal." A simple florist possessed zero knowledge of werewolf anatomy or silver extraction. Furthermore, that specific root grew exclusively in the lightless smuggling tunnels beneath the city. As she leaned back, her collar slipped, revealing a jagged, violent brand scarred into her left shoulder. Someone had marked her. He caught sight of a black burner phone sitting next to a stack of crumpled cash on the potting counter. "You run with the smugglers," Kalen stated. She stiffened, pulling her collar up. "I run alone. The rogues outside use undercity ports to smuggle silver weapons." Kalen braced his good arm against the brick, forcing himself upright. "I need their supplier." She scrambled backward. "No, that world is dead to me." "It resurrects tonight," Kalen growled, the vibration rumbling deep in his chest. "Help me track the silver, or I let the city guards know what you cultivate in the dark." She stared at him, her defiance cracking against the reality of her cage.
10 minutes later, the stench of wild predator and spilled blood still choked the greenhouse. Elara stood over the steel sink, aggressively scrubbing the pink water from her knuckles. Bloodstains, forever, if ignored, so she dragged the bristle brush across her skin until her hands burned. A few feet away, the towering shifter leaned against her potting counter. He watched her. His golden eyes tracked every frantic twitch of her shoulders, projecting a quiet, lethal energy that made her stomach churn. She needed an exit. Elara abandoned the sink and marched into the back office. She dragged a faded canvas duffel from under the desk, shoving clothes and loose cash inside. The smell of the dark, green moss triggered a violent memory of salt and dead fish. The exact scent of the shipping container Silas locked her inside when she was 16. She promised herself she would never return to the pitch black. Zipping the duffel tight, she slipped back into the main room and aimed for the side door. Kalen rested with his eyes closed, his breathing labored, but steady. She took one quiet step toward the exit. A grey wolf stepped out of the fog, blocking the shattered glass door. A second black wolf flanked it, lips pulled back to reveal gleaming teeth. The black beast bore a stark white scar across its left eye, staring directly at her with pinpoint focus. Elara stopped dead, the duffel strap slipping down her arm. "My enforcers!" Kalen's rough voice scraped across the room. "They tracked my blood." She spun around. The alpha stood at full height, discarding the guise of a dying man. Silas's assassins hunted him, bringing a violent wolf pack straight to her doorstep. Here they formed a complete perimeter around the glass walls. Before she could calculate a new route, the burner phone chimed with a harsh electronic ping. Elara lunged for the counter. Kalen crossed the space instantly, snatching the plastic device right out of her reach. He tapped the screen. "Message from Silas," Kalen read, his tone dropping into a deadly flat rumble. "I know you hide in there, little weed. Bring me the alpha's head, or I burn your glass house down." The greenhouse windows suddenly groaned against the rising wind, rattling the iron frames. The plastic phone casing exploded against the brick wall. Shards scattered across the wet tiles, pinging against the ceramic pots. The ringing in Elara's ears peaked, leaving a suffocating silence in the wake of the violent crash. She stared at the broken pieces. Silas brought the war to her front door, ensuring her clean life ended tonight. "He kills everyone," Elara rasped. "He leaves no witnesses." "He can try." Kalen stared down at her, his amber eyes burning with obsessed territorial fire. "This is my city." She looked at her blooming orchids. She looked at the mud, tracking across her pristine floor. She lost the sanctuary, but she refused to lose her life. Elara squared her shoulders, tilting her chin up to meet the alpha's glowing stare. "I will guide you," she stated firmly, "but I set the rules. You keep your pack out of my greenhouse. You follow my lead underground. When we finish, you disappear." Kalen studied her face, a flicker of genuine respect cutting through his anger. He gave a single, slow nod. He turned toward the ruined back doors and whistled sharply into the rain. Outside, bones cracked and flesh tore in a brutal, wet symphony of shifting anatomy. Two tall, muscular men stood naked in the downpour seconds later. They tossed a dry coat through the shattered frame. Kalen caught the jacket. "We leave now." He offered his calloused hand. "Stay close." Elara ignored the gesture. She grabbed her waterproof jacket and marched past him into the storm. Rain soaked her hair by the time they reached the black SUV idling in the alley. She climbed into the passenger seat, shivering against the freezing leather. The confined space smelled like wet dog and gunpowder. The engine roared to life, tires spinning against the slick pavement as the vehicle plunged into the undercity. As the streetlights faded into complete blackness, Kalen shifted the SUV into gear. He slowly turned his head to look at her, his pupils blown entirely wide in the dark.
Steel elevator doors parted with a soft electronic ping. Kalen stepped into the sterile penthouse, his wet boots leaving dark tracks across the gleaming white marble. Designed like a bank vault, the climate-controlled air inside hung completely dead, stifling the stench of wet dog and freezing rain clinging to his clothes. Elara emerged from the steel box right behind him. She gripped the canvas strap of her bag, her knuckles bone white as her eyes tracked the perimeter of the sprawling room. 10 enforcers froze mid-motion. They caught the foreign scent instantly, their predatory gazes locking onto the stranger, carrying the smell of greenhouse dirt and faint silver poison. Kalen let a low vibration rattle in his throat, projecting a quiet, lethal warning across the marble. "Stand down," the rumble demanded. His beta Jax, he ignored the command. The tall enforcer stepped forward, the jagged burn scar on his neck pulling tight. "You brought a human into the den?" Jax asked, his tone scraping like sandpaper. Kalen shifted his broad shoulders, subtly blocking the beta's line of sight to Elara. "She tracks the undercity ports. She guides us." The pack went perfectly still. 10 pairs of hostile eyes tracked the small woman, waiting for her to break. She refused to blink. Stepping out from behind Kalen's frame, Elara leveled her stare directly at the beta. "Your South Dock cameras are blind," she stated flatly. The hum of the refrigerator in the open kitchen suddenly felt deafening. Dust drifted through the recessed lighting as the insult registered across the room. "Excuse me?" Jax growled. Elara pointed a single, steady finger at the digital surveillance map glowing on the far wall. Shipping containers stacked too high on Pier 4. They create a shadow loop. Silas moves his metal straight through the dark. Kalen swallowed the metallic taste of adrenaline pooling under his tongue. She dismantled a highly trained enforcer's security grid in 2 breaths. "Fix Pier 4, Kalen ordered. Jax ground his teeth together, throwing a furious glare at the floor before giving a stiff nod. Dismissing the pack, Kalen turned back to the florist. The harsh overhead lighting exposed her pale, exhausted face. "Come," he murmured. He guided her down a dim corridor, the thick carpet absorbing the sound of their footsteps. Reaching a spare bedroom, he pushed the wooden door open. "You're safe here," Kalen offered. Elara stared at the pristine mattress, and then dragged her gaze up to his glowing amber eyes. "Safety is just a story we tell ourselves so we can sleep," she replied. She stepped inside and shut the door. The latch clicked loudly, severing the space between them and leaving Kalen alone in the dark with the lingering scent of her blood.
Dawn brought no sunlight to the undercity, only the suffocating stench of rotting garbage and damp concrete. Trading the sterile penthouse for the gutters, Elara pulled a dark hood over her hair and descended the crooked steps into a basement flower shop. Dead ferns choked the display windows, serving as a rotting front for the largest black market in the district. A short, bald man emerged from the back room before she reached the glass counter. Benny. He chewed a splintered toothpick, owing her his life from the old smuggling routes. "Well, well," Benny chuckled, a wet, rattling sound. "The little weed returns to the dirt." Bile rose in her throat. She slammed a thick stack of stolen cash onto the cracked glass. "I need names," Elara demanded. "Who moves the silver for Silas at Pier 4? Benny stopped chewing. His smile vanished, replaced by a frantic glance toward the empty alley outside. He leaned over the counter, smelling like stale beer and panic. "You play a dead man's game," Benny whispered. "Silas buys up every silver blade in the state." Her fingers shot out, twisting into the greasy collar of his shirt. She yanked him forward, ignoring the frantic pulse hammering in her own wrists. "Where does the next shipment drop?" she hissed. The memory of freezing snow and bare feet threatened to paralyze her legs, but she forced the terror down. "Warehouse 9!" Benny choked, hands flying up in surrender. "Tonight, midnight." She shoved him back and snatched her cash off the glass. "Silas hunts you," Benny called out as she backed toward the door. "He wants his little weed back." The blood drained from her face, leaving her fingers completely numb. Silas didn't just want the wolves. He laid a trap for her. Elara bolted up the stairs, bursting back onto the rainy street. A black SUV idled near the corner drain, water slicking off the dark paint. When Kaylin pushed the passenger door open from the inside, the heat of the cab washed over her freezing skin. She hated the instant relief crashing into her chest. She climbed onto the leather seat, water dripping from her chin. "Warehouse 9, tonight." Kaylin shifted the car into gear, his knuckles flexing around the steering wheel. "Then we hunt." The tires spun against the wet asphalt, plunging the vehicle deep into the grey fog.
By midnight, the storm reduced the undercity to a flooded wasteland. Warehouse 9 loomed out of the downpour like a rusting iron corpse. Kaylin crouched behind a stack of splintered shipping pallets, letting the freezing rain soak completely through his dark clothes. Elara knelt inches away. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow bursts, but her focus remained locked on the loading bay. 4 guards at the main entrance, Kaylin observed, his voice barely audible over the rain. The bitter, acidic tang of raw silver carried on the wind, burning his sinuses. One deep cut could stop his heart. "The loading crane," Elara murmured, pointing upward. Following her line of sight, he spotted the yellow machinery hanging directly over the bay doors. It suspended a bundle of steel pipes right above the armed men. "I can reach the control box," she whispered. "I drop the pipes, you take the scattered guards." He grabbed her wrist, his thumb pressing against her racing pulse. Too dangerous. "I am not glass, Kaylin," she snapped, jerking her arm free. The wild, unbreakable fire burning in her eyes silenced his argument. She possessed a terrifying brand of courage. He gave a single, slow nod. Elara slipped into the shadows, moving like a ghost through the flooded yard. He tracked her ascent up the rusted ladder, waiting with coiled muscles. A metallic screech tore the night in half. The armed men jerked their heads up. Cables snapped with the crack of a gunshot. The iron pipes plummeted, slamming into the concrete with a deafening, earth-shaking crash. The vibration rattled Kaylin's teeth. Puddles splashed violently into the air. Silence hung for a fraction of a heartbeat before a guard screamed. Kaylin exploded from the pallets. He crossed the yard in a lethal blur, tackling the closest rogue. Bone crunched under his fist. Spinning on his heel, he caught the second guard's arm, snapping the limb backward until the joint popped. The remaining 2 scrambled toward the alley, but Kaylin closed the distance instantly, driving them both into the brick wall. They hit the wet ground, completely unconscious. Rain hammered against the scattered pipes. Kaylin dragged air into his burning lungs, letting the red haze of adrenaline slowly recede. He turned toward the crane. Elara climbed down the ladder, her boots hitting the pavement with a wet slap. As she closed the distance between them, violent tremors wrecked her small frame. The reality of the violence crashed into her system. "Are they dead?" she asked, her voice cracking. "No," Kaylin answered. Stepping closer, he unbuttoned his soaked coat and wrapped the dark fabric entirely around her shoulders. She stood completely frozen against his chest, her teeth chattering loudly over the storm. "You did good," he rumbled. She stared up at him, water plastering her dark hair to her pale cheeks. "I am freezing," I know, he murmured. He reached out, his thumb slowly brushing a streak of grease from her cold jawline. The lethal Alpha and the undercity smuggler stood completely still among the ruined bodies, waiting for the real monster to step out of the dark.
A sharp spasm of pain tore through her left shoulder. Elara hissed, letting the red marker slip from her grip. It clattered against the wide oak table, staining the edge of the sprawling city map laid out inside the quiet penthouse. Across the room, Kalen tracked the flinch, his golden eyes locked onto her posture with absolute predatory focus. "You took a hit," he stated. Before she could shift her weight, the floorboards creaked behind her. The heat of his broad chest radiated against her spine. She tried to step forward, but his calloused fingers hooked the collar of her shirt and pushed the fabric aside. He exposed the jagged brand burned deep into her skin. "Who marked you?" he demanded. The words scraped out of his throat, low and lethal. Elara yanked the collar up. She refused to look at him. "It doesn't matter." Dust motes drifted under the warm chandelier light. The hum of the city traffic sat 30 floors below them, muffled and distant. "It matters to me," he murmured, his breath brushing the shell of her ear. "Silas did this, didn't he?" The scent of dark pine anchored her in the present, but the ghost of the burn dragged her violently backward. "I was 19, she stated softly. "I tried to steal a crate of exotic seeds. I wanted to start a real garden. Silas caught me. He heated a shipping hook until the iron glowed red. His hands closed over her hips. The sudden, scorching heat of his grip sent a shockwave through her exhausted muscles. He wanted to remind me I belonged to the dirt," she finished. She swiped a stray tear from her cheek before it could drop. "I am just a weed." Kalen spun her around. "You survive," Kalen growled, stepping completely into her space. "You adapt. You fight back. You are not a weed." He leaned down, erasing the distance between them. The raw heat pulling them together drowned out the entire room. She tilted her chin up, letting her eyelashes flutter shut. A shrill electronic scream shattered the quiet. The satellite phone vibrated violently across the oak table. They snapped apart. Kalen snatched the receiver, his knuckles turning stark white around the plastic. He listened, staring blankly at the far wall. "They intercepted a silver shipment at the old train yard," he announced. His amber eyes shifted back to her, flashing with total war.
20 minutes later, the rusted train yard choked on the stench of wet gravel and rotting iron. Kalen stepped out of the black SUV, leading Jax through the fog toward a solitary shipping container sitting entirely off the main tracks. Kalen jammed his fingers into the gap of the steel doors and ripped them backward. Metal shrieked into the damp night. He waited for the metallic echo to fade into the fog before stepping inside. Jax clicked a tactical flashlight on, letting the white beam cut through the pitch black. They found 0 crates. They found 0 silver daggers. Printed photographs plastered the ribbed steel walls. Hundreds of them. Kalen stopped breathing. The blood rushed out of his face, pooling cold in his boots. Elara watering ferns, Elara walking to the bakery. Elara sitting in the passenger seat of his vehicle just yesterday. Dead center hung a typed manifesto, signed at the bottom in thick crimson ink. "He is not hunting the pack," Jax rasped. Kalen stared at the shrine. "He is hunting her." A shadow broker breached their perimeter, mapped their patrol routes, and cornered his survivor without snapping a single twig. He dragged her straight into the center of a lethal bullseye. A rhythmic, electronic chirp echoed from the very back of the container. Kalen tracked the sound. A small red diode blinked steadily behind the paper manifesto, wired directly into a brick of raw silver shrapnel. A high-grade explosive. "Move!" Kalen roared. He grabbed Jax by the tactical vest and hurled the beta backward out of the open doors. Gravel crunched frantically behind them. Elara burst from the shadows of the train tracks, her coat completely soaked. She tracked the SUV through the city. "Kaelin!" she screamed. The blinking red diode shifted to a solid, unblinking glare. Kaelin launched himself forward. He tackled Elara to the wet earth, wrapping his broad frame entirely over her fragile spine just as the detonator clicked. White fire tore the dark night wide open.
The shockwave blasted the oxygen straight out of the rail yard. Elara choked on thick ash and bitter dirt, her ears screaming with a high-pitched ring. The crushing weight pinning her to the gravel shifted with a wet, ragged grunt. She swallowed the metallic taste of blood coating her teeth. She waited for her vision to stop spinning before she pushed up onto her knees. Kaelin rolled onto his side. The blast shredded the back of his coat, leaving his skin raw, blistered, and weeping from a dozen silver-laced cuts. "You held together," Kaelin rasped, coughing black soot onto the rocks. "Stay down," she commanded, pressing her dirt-stained palms flat against his uninjured chest. Orange flames devoured the steel container, throwing wild shadows across the tracks. Jack sprinted through the smoke, hauling the bleeding alpha to his feet. A violent buzz vibrated against Elara's hip. She froze, slipping a hand into her coat pocket. Her fingers brushed cold plastic. A burner phone. Someone dropped it on her during the chaos. She pressed the speaker to her ear. "Did you enjoy the fireworks, little weed?" A cultured voice purred. The ambient heat of the burning train yard vanished. Silas. The cadence of his voice chained her right back to a pitch-black smuggling crate. "What do you want?" Her tone offered zero negotiation. "Your night-blooming jasmine looks lovely under the moonlight," Silas chuckled. "It would be a tragedy if those white petals burned." A sickening drop hollowed out her stomach. He stood inside her sanctuary. He held a match to the only clean thing she ever built. "Do not touch them," she ordered. "Come home, Elara," Silas countered softly. "Yo, or I burn the glass to the ground. You have 1 hour." A click severed the connection. Elara stared at the cracked plastic screen. Kaelin bled on the tracks for her. The wolves would die protecting her. She refused to be the bait that killed them. She locked her knees, shoving the terror into a dark box in the back of her mind. Street smarts took the wheel. She marched directly up to the beta. "Jax," she demanded, holding out an open palm. "Give me your gun." The beta stared at her outstretched hand as the flames painted her fierce, unbroken silhouette against the dark. The dark steel of Jax's tactical pistol leached the warmth from her shaking fingers. Instead of running blindly into the storm to save her burning greenhouse, Elara turned her back on the sanctuary. Marching straight into the syndicate's armored kitchen, she dropped her canvas duffel onto the steel island. Glass vials clinked against the metal. She unscrewed a jar of toxic sap, forcing her racing pulse to steady. Gauze wrapped tightly around his broad chest. Kaelin stepped through the doorway. He tracked her hands as she mixed the green sap with a chemical solvent. "You're not going back to the greenhouse," he stated. "If I go to the greenhouse, he ambushes us," she murmured, securing the cap on a glass dart. "We hit the secondary weapons vault. We bleed him." Carefully, she poured the bubbling liquid into 3 hollow darts. Reaching deeper into her bag, her fingers closed around a black vial containing a purple extract. She slipped the glass into her left boot, hiding the poison behind the leather. He crossed the kitchen, erasing the distance between them. The sharp scent of rubbing alcohol and wild pine thickened the air. "You sacrifice your home for my pack," he rumbled. "I protect what matters," she answered. A calloused thumb dragged across her cheekbone, wiping away a smear of soot. Stepping back, he grabbed a pair of silver-plated knives from the counter. The metal scraped against the sheath, signaling the start of a war.
Deep beneath the industrial district, The underground vault choked on the stench of machine oil and stale blood. Without breaking stride, Kalen drove his boot into the steel doors. Metal hinges snapped. The doors crashed inward. He embraced the violent shift. Bones cracked and realigned in a brutal, wet sequence of tearing muscle. He hit the concrete floor as a lethal shadow of fur and claws. 4 armed guards raised their silver-laced rifles. The wolf lunged. He crossed the room in a dark blur, swiping giant claws to throw 2 men against the far wall. Dodging a silver bullet, he crushed the barrel of a 3rd rifle between his jaws. High above the chaos, Elara slipped along the rusted catwalk. She raised the modified dart gun, bracing the stock against her shoulder. She pulled the trigger twice. Compressed air hissed. Our 2 rogues collapsed onto the concrete, paralyzed instantly by the toxic moss. The final guard hit the floor. The hum of the fluorescent lights rushed back into the quiet vault. Dust drifted through the cold air as the wolf panted. Flesh knitted back into a human silhouette. Kalen dragged a spare shirt over his scarred shoulders, fighting the intoxicating adrenaline still pumping through his veins. Elara descended the metal ladder. Her cheeks burned with a flush of dangerous energy. Kalen closed the distance, trapping her firmly against the wall. The air between them ignited. "You are magnificent," he rasped. His fingers tangled in her messy hair. Grabbing his dark collar, she dragged his mouth down to hers. The kiss erupted. He tasted like rain and copper, devouring her breath as his hands mapped the curve of her waist. She let out a soft moan. Footsteps slammed against the concrete outside. The metal doors groaned. Jack stood in the ruined threshold, his face drained of all color. His hands trembled violently against his sides. "Alpha," Jax choked out. "Little Leo. Silas took him." The temperature in the vault plummeted, turning the lingering heat of their kiss into pure ice.
An hour later, the penthouse air tasted like defeat. Elara followed Kalen and Jax into the sprawling living room. Devastation painted the faces of the pack. Wolves paced the marble floor, tracking mud across the rugs, while the women wept silently in the corners. Every hostile gaze eventually locked onto Elara. A video message lit up the tablet in Jax's hand. The screen showed Silas sitting in a leather chair. A silver cage sat on the floor beside him, holding a weeping 10-year-old boy. "A trade, Alpha," Silas smiled, his cultured voice echoing off the walls. "My little weed for your little dog. You have until dawn." Kalen snatched the tablet and hurled it across the room. Glass exploded against the plaster. The ringing crash left a suffocating silence in its wake. He dragged air into his burning lungs. "Can we go to war?" Kalen commanded the room. "We tear the docks apart." Elara watched the Alpha unravel. He planned to sacrifice his entire army to keep a smuggler safe. While Kalen mapped a suicide mission with his beta, she retreated down the dark hallway. She grabbed her canvas duffel. She packed the spare cash. She packed her final resolve. Reaching down into her leather boot, she brushed her fingers against the cold glass of the purple vial, her secret weapon, her final exit. She scratched a brief note onto a torn piece of paper and dropped it onto Kalen's pristine mattress. Slipping out the back staircase, Elara stepped into the freezing rain. Water soaked her hair as she marched directly toward the devil waiting in the dark.
Rain slashed through the shattered penthouse window, pooling across the ruined marble. The scent of ozone and spilled blood choked the living room, masking the sharp metallic tang of the broken tablet on the floor. 3 gray-muzzled elders blocked the hallway leading to the guest rooms. Fangs dragged past their wrinkled lips, saliva beading on the pristine rug. They ignored the storm blowing through the glass. They demanded a sacrifice. "Bring us the human," Marcus demanded, his voice rattling the crystal chandelier. "She brought this curse to our door." Kalen stepped directly into their path. He let a low, territorial rumble vibrate deep in his chest, projecting absolute lethal authority. The memory of his dying father coughing up blood on the winter solstice flashed through his mind. A true king protects the broken. A true king never trades an innocent life for a safe harbor. "You do not touch her," Kalen stated. Marcus bared his teeth, taking a rigid step forward. "She is a criminal. You risk the entire bloodline for a street rat." Kalen closed the distance instantly. Grabbing Marcus by the collar, the Alpha drove the elder backward into the stone fireplace. Mortar cracked under the brutal impact. Dust drifted down into the cold ashes below. Kalen held him pinned against the rocks, waiting for the vibration to completely fade from the floorboards before speaking. "She is my equal," Kalen growled, his amber eyes burning entirely wide. "She fought for this land. She sacrificed her own sanctuary to arm us. If any wolf lays a hand on her, I will tear your throats out myself." The remaining elders backed away, dropping their gazes to the wet floor. They surrendered the argument, but the kingdom fractured beneath Kalen's boots. Releasing Marcus, he turned toward the dark hallway. He needed the grounding scent of dirt and rain. He pushed her bedroom door open. Freezing wind hit his face. The window sat wide open. The mattress lay completely empty. A single folded piece of paper rested squarely on his pillow. Kalen crossed the room, his calloused fingers unfolding the torn scrap. "I am the poison." The paper crumpled inside his fist. She traded her life for the pack. He turned toward the open window, his golden eyes locking onto the dark city skyline as a devastating, wordless roar tore out of his lungs.
2 miles from the penthouse, the freezing downpour turned to boiling steam. Black ash coated Elara's tongue as she sprinted down the flooded avenue. She abandoned the safety of the wolves to gather one final toxic root from her sanctuary before surrendering to the devil. Rounding the corner, her boots skidded to a dead halt. The pristine glass dome buckled inward. Giant orange flames devoured the hanging vines, spitting white-hot shrapnel across the wet pavement as the iron frames collapsed. Dropping to the muddy sidewalk, Elara let the inferno blister her numb cheeks. She swallowed the thick soot coating her throat. The deafening roar of the fire drowned out the wail of distant sirens. The pop and crack of exploding glass echoed off the brick alleyways, leaving a hollow, agonizing silence in her chest. Sure, she remembered planting her very first seed in a cracked teacup as a hungry 16-year-old. That tiny green sprout proved that even broken things could grow toward the light. Tonight, every fragile leaf she ever nurtured turned to charcoal. Silas systematically burned her identity to the ground, leaving only the dirty, undercity smuggler behind. The heat offered a cruel, agonizing comfort against her freezing skin. Elara pushed off the concrete. She wiped the dirty rainwater from her jaw, erasing the despair from her features. Cold, tactical numbness took over. Reaching down into her leather boot, her fingers traced the smooth glass of the purple extract. Turning her back on the burning ruins, she marched directly toward the shipping docks. She walked entirely alone into the dark, carrying death in her pocket. The rusted iron gates of the shipping yard parted with a metallic shriek. Elara stepped into the flooded warehouse, her boots sinking into a slick puddle of machine oil and brine. Rain dripped from rusted holes in the corrugated ceiling. Overhead, halogens buzzed to life. With a blinding glare, Silas sat in a velvet wingback chair in the absolute center of the cracked concrete. He wore a tailored suit, projecting the calm energy of a boardroom executive rather than a shadow broker. A silver-plated cage rested on the floor beside his polished shoes. Little Leo huddled against the far bars, whimpering as the metal burned red welts into his skin. "Stop hurting him," Elara ordered, her tone flat and completely dead. Silas chuckled, waving a manicured hand. Two armed guards grabbed Elara's elbows from the shadows. They drove her violently to her knees, bone bruised against the stone floor. "Look at you," Silas mocked, standing up from his chair, "covered in mud, smelling like wet dog. I always knew you would return to the dirt." She refused to flinch. "Let the boy go. I surrender." Silas laughed, a sharp sound that echoed off the empty shipping crates. He grabbed her chin, forcing her gaze up to his dead, flat eyes. "I am not trading you," Silas purred. "I keep you both. When your foolish alpha arrives, I will slaughter him while you watch." Her pulse hammered violently against her eardrums. She threw her weight against the guards, but calloused hands locked her shoulders in a brutal grip. "You poison everything you touch," Silas whispered, leaning an inch from her face. "You brought death to that pack. You are a criminal. You will never be anything else." The final shred of resistance snapped inside her chest. She stopped fighting the grip of the guards, letting her chin drop back toward her collarbone. She accepted the reality of the concrete floor. Silas snapped his fingers. "Lock her in the isolation container. Let her rot in the dark until the wolves arrive." The guards dragged her away from the halogen glare. They shoved her over the metal threshold of a pitch-black shipping crate. The iron doors slammed shut, plunging the world into absolute darkness. The external deadbolt snapped into place. Elara sat on the freezing metal floor. She pulled her knees tight against her chest, waiting in total sensory deprivation while the shadows swallowed her alive.
The stench of scorched earth and wet ash coated the back of Kalen's throat. He dropped to his knees in the black mud, staring at the twisted iron of the ruined conservatory. Rain hissed violently against the glowing coals. Pressing his bare palms deep into the ruined soil, he searched for residual energy. He found a single, unburned fragment of a jasmine leaf near the threshold. She had come here first. She bypassed the escape routes and marched straight into her own personal hell to buy the pack time. The storm hammered the metal debris. He swallowed the bitter taste of soot, waiting for the ringing in his ears to fade. Letting the reality of her sacrifice settle into his bones, the despair burned away, replaced by a violent, unyielding fire. He stood up. Water slicked his dark hair against his skull. A low rumble vibrated in his chest, and rising into a deafening roar that shook the flooded alley. By the time Kalen shattered the penthouse elevator doors, the marble floor echoed with open mutiny. Elder Marcus paced the room, shouting demands for a new alpha. The mutiny died the second Kalen stepped into the light. "She didn't run," Kalen growled, his fangs dropping over his bottom lip. "She surrendered to Silas to buy us time." The pacing wolves froze in place. Kalen projected a lethal, suffocating aura across the room, forcing the elders to their knees. They whined, clutching their throats as the dominants pushed them against the floorboards. She fought for the light. She fought for this pack. Kalen commanded, kicking a broken chair across the floor. "We fight for her." Jack stepped up right behind him. The beta drew his silver-plated knives. The younger wolves let out low, unified growls, their eyes flashing with golden light. "What is the plan, Alpha?" Jax asked. A dark, lethal smile cut across Kalen's face. He remembered the fatal security flaw Elara mapped out on her first night. The shadow loop at Pier 4. "We bypass the stealth," Kalen ordered. "We hit the front gate. We tear the metal down. We bathe the docks in blood." Every wolf in the room stared back, entirely ready to bleed for a human girl. The pack surged toward the stairwell, plunging directly into the stormy night.
Miles away at Pier 4, the suffocating darkness inside the steel container tasted like rust and salt. Elara curled into a tight ball on the freezing floor. Blindness consumed her. Silas had buried her alive. She remembered a pitch-black cellar at 12 years old, crying until her throat bled. The poison, the weed. Then a warm memory brushed the back of her mind. Kaylin's rough voice echoed through the dark. "You are the strongest thing I have ever met." An alpha king saw something unbreakable inside a dirty street kid. A bright spark of anger ignited in her chest. She survived the streets. She survived Silas. She refused to die in a box. Elara sat up straight. Reaching into her left boot, her fingers traced the smooth glass of the black vial, the purple extract. She felt the wall until her knuckles hit the steel door. As tracing her way to the internal locking mechanism, she popped the cork. An acidic stench burned her nostrils. Nightshade root extract, a highly corrosive solvent. She poured the liquid directly into the iron gears. The metal hissed violently. White smoke flooded the dark container as the acid ate straight through the lock. Elara waited for the bubbling to stop, coughing against the toxic fumes before driving both boots into the door. The ruined lock snapped completely in half. Pale dock light spilled over her boots. She crawled out of the smoke. The sprawling warehouse sat mostly empty, the guards abandoning their posts to watch the perimeter. Little Leo huddled inside the silver cage against the far wall, whimpering into his knees. Elara snatched an iron pipe from the concrete floor. She marched toward the cage, untrading the frightened botanist for a lethal undercity queen. She swung the pipe, smashing the digital control panel with everything she had. Sparks showered the concrete. The cage door popped open. "Come on, Leo," she ordered, dragging the terrified boy out. "We go home?" A blaring alarm suddenly ripped through the warehouse, painting the walls in flashing red light.
Outside the warehouse, a terrifying roar split the rainy night in half. Kaylin sprinted across the flooded access road, leading a tidal wave of golden-eyed wolves straight toward the perimeter. Jax and 3 enforcers piloted a stolen garbage truck directly through the reinforced iron gates. The metal shrieked. Sparks rained down on the wet asphalt. The crash faded, leaving a sudden, terrifying quiet before 50 armed rogues spilled from the shadows, raising their silver rifles. "No prisoners," Kaylin commanded, his eyes burning like twin suns. The dockyard erupted into absolute chaos. Kaylin dismantled the front line. He ducked under a spray of silver bullets, grabbed a rogue by the tactical vest, and hurled the man 30 feet into the freezing ocean. The pack fought with the terrifying fury of a threatened family. Spotting 3 shooters flanking his beta, Kaylin lunged. He tackled all 3 guards simultaneously. Bones cracked under his boots. The stench of spilled blood and a wet asphalt created a sickening perfume. He refused to stop. He needed to breach the main warehouse. He needed his mate. Ripping a steel door from a guard shack, Kaylin used the metal shield to block a barrage of gunfire as he charged across the open yard. High above the slaughter, Silas stood on a rusted catwalk. The shadow broker laughed, bracing a silver-plated sniper rifle against the railing. "You are too late, dog," Silas shouted over the gunfire. Kaylin dragged air into his burning lungs. A flash of movement caught his peripheral vision. Down on the ground level, a small figure slipped between the shipping containers. Covered in dirt, gripping an iron pipe, and dragging a young wolf pup by the hand. Elara. Relief threatened to drop the alpha to his knees. She broke her own cage, but Silas tracked the movement. The crime lord pivoted, aiming the glowing scope directly at Elara's back. "No!" Kaylin roared, the sound tearing his throat to shreds. The alpha dug his boots into the asphalt, launching his broad frame into the deadly crossfire to intercept the bullet.
The deafening crack of a sniper rifle split the downpour. Air displaced violently as a silver bullet tore through the dark. Before the sound fully registered, Kaylin launched his broad frame into the crossfire. He took the grazing hit to the shoulder, Hot blood sprayed across the wet asphalt. The alpha hit the ground, a ragged gasp tearing from his throat as the silver poison burned into his muscle like battery acid. Elara swallowed the scream rising in her chest. She refused to hide while he bled. High above the dockyard, Silas braced his rifle against the metal catwalk railing. The shadow broker laughed, the cruel sound cutting through the rain. Elara scanned the debris. A torn sack of industrial fertilizer sat near a ruptured steam pipe. Her calloused fingers locked onto the thick plastic. She dragged the bag directly underneath the iron catwalk. Rusted metal groaned loudly overhead as Silas tracked her movement. Gripping her iron pipe, she swung with every ounce of her strength against the hissing steam valve. Iron clanged against iron. Concentrated nitrate mixed violently with boiling water. The chemical reaction detonated. A blinding cloud of white smoke shot upward, carrying the foul stench of sulfur and burning chemicals straight into Silas's face. The crime lord shrieked. He dropped the rifle. It clattered against the metal floorboards. Stumbling backward blindly, Silas hit the low railing and flipped entirely over the edge. He plummeted 30 feet. Silas crashed into a stack of wooden shipping crates. Pines splintered. Bones snapped under the brutal impact. Dust plumed into the damp air, dancing under the harsh floodlights. Elara waited for the ringing in her skull to fade. She tasted sulfur on her tongue. When the soot cleared, Kalen stood over the broken shadow broker. Blood soaked the alpha's shirt, but his amber eyes burned with lethal fire. Jax and the enforcers formed a tight perimeter around the crater, baring their fangs. The remaining rogues dropped their silver blades into the mud. Elara dropped the iron pipe. She rushed to the silver cage, throwing the damaged latch open and pulling little Leo into her arms. The boy buried his face in her soaked jacket. Kalen crossed the asphalt. He reached out, pulling her and the pup against his uninjured side. "You are safe," Kalen rasped. She buried her face in his throat, inhaling the sharp scent of wild pine over the stench of gunpowder. The nightmare finally bled out on the concrete.
Dawn crept over the Atlantic, turning the freezing fog a pale gray. Red police sirens reflected off the deep puddles scattered across the ruined dockyard. The pack secured the defeated rogues with steel cables, tossing the surviving mercenaries into armored transport trucks. Kalen sat on the bumper of a stolen ambulance. A pack combat medic wrapped clean gauze around his torn shoulder. The silver bullet drained his stamina, leaving a deep, throbbing ache radiating through his bones. He ignored the pain, tracking Elara across the flooded yard. She sat on a splintered crate. Dark soot coated her cheekbones. Holding a damp cloth, she carefully wiped the dirt from Leo's tear-stained face. She looked entirely unbroken. Jax approached the ambulance. The tall beta lowered his chin in absolute respect. "The docks belong to us again," Jax reported softly. "The enemy is broken." Kalen pushed off the bumper. They belonged to her, too. The ambient noise of the cleanup ceased. Every wolf turned toward the humans sitting in the mud. They saw the feral survivor who shattered the cage and brought down a king. Elder Marcus stepped out of the fog. The gray-muzzled wolf lowered his head completely, exposing his throat to Elara in total submission. The rest of the pack followed, bowing to their undercity queen. Kalen crossed the yard. He stopped in front of her crate. She looked up, her lips parted slightly, as she took in the bowing wolves. Kalen reached down, wrapping his calloused fingers around her dirt-stained hand. "You do not have to hide anymore," he murmured. She stared at her ruined boots. "My sanctuary is gone." He hooked his thumb under her chin, tilting her gaze up to meet his glowing eyes. "We build a new one," Kalen promised, "higher up, where nobody touches you." He leaned down, capturing her mouth in front of the entire pack. The kiss held zero desperation. It tasted like rain and copper, grounding the adrenaline of the long night into a slow, deliberate promise. She wrapped her arms around his neck, anchoring herself to the only home she needed.
6 months later, the bitter winter yielded to the suffocating heat of the city summer. Elara stood at the edge of the syndicate penthouse roof, 70 floors above the asphalt. The wind carried the faint scent of exhaust fumes, but the air up here belonged strictly to the sky. She built an open-air garden across the concrete tiles. Purple vines scaled the brick parapets. Night-blooming jasmine spilled from terracotta pots, while ferns swayed under the afternoon sun. Leo sat on a wooden bench in the corner, flipping the pages of a comic book. Wearing a white tank top and faded denim, Elara packed fresh soil around a fragile seedling. The jagged brand on her left shoulder sat completely exposed to the sunlight. She refused to hide the scarred flesh. The burn proved she survived the fire. The steel roof door groaned on its hinges. The scent of wild pine and dark earth washed over the rooftop before his boots struck the concrete. Elara smiled, brushing the dirt from her knuckles. Kalen wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, pulling her spine flush against his chest. He wore a cotton shirt, his heartbeat drumming a steady rhythm against her shoulder blades. He rested his chin on her crown. "The garden thrives," he rumbled. She leaned back into his solid frame. "It needs more water in the corner, but it takes root." He turned her around. The lethal edge was gone from his amber eyes, replaced by a quiet, protective calm. "You take root," Kalen murmured. She traced his hard jawline with a thumb. "I am exactly where I belong." He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her dirty palm. "I have my pack. I have my city. I have my queen." Under the sprawling blue sky, he pulled her into a slow, breathless kiss. The shadows of the undercity finally let her go. She stood surrounded by blooming life, entirely tethered to the monster who gave her the sun.